The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. And we say hello to Dennis Kucinich, served as mayor of Cleveland from 1977 to 1979, later as a member of the U.S. House of Representatives. He also sought the Democratic nomination for president in 2004 and 2008, and now is the author of a new book, The Division of Light and Power. Dennis Kucinich, thanks for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
I'm very grateful for the opportunity, and thank you. I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Well, thank you. We do appreciate your time as well. And, this is a story about your fight against privatizing Cleveland's city-owned power system. This happened back in the late 70s when you were mayor. So boiling it down to broad themes, remind us briefly what that fight was all about.
Well, in a nutshell, it was about a private utility monopoly, an investor-owned utility, which engaged in corporate espionage, sabotage, interfering in the internal affairs of the city of Cleveland in order to try to force the city to sell its municipal electric system to them so they could have a bigger monopoly. I mean, that was the core of the battle, but as the book is outlined, it's a lot more than that.
Now, your decision to block the sale of the city's power plant set off a fierce battle involving some tactics on the part of those pushing you to sell the power system. There was even an assassination attempt on you. How do you understand why your opponents would go so far?
There's a lot of money on the line. I mean, I'm talking to you from Cleveland, Ohio, a home that I've lived in for 50 years. And just over my shoulder here was high-powered rifle shot was fired, missed me by a fraction of an inch. And, I was at that point when that happened, leading the effort to block the sale. And I was the only person leading that effort to block the sale. So I never discussed when I was in office the safety issues. But later on, a NBC investigative reporter for Cleveland interviewed a convicted hitman who said, yeah, he would have taken the job, except he was picked up and he wanted 80 grand at that point. This was, 40 some years ago. And that the reason was because, this is quoting him, we couldn't buy Kucinich. That's what I was told, he said. There was an attempt to there was an assassination plot that was supposed to unfold in October of 1978, according to a U.S. subcommittee on organized crime. It was their report that said that there was a plan to take a shot at me in a parade on Cleveland's east side. And I think, and the reason why I wasn't in the parade is that I was struck with a bleeding ulcer just as I was getting ready to go to the event, and I was rushed to the hospital, and so that attempt was scuttled. And then there are other stories that are in the book about the dangers, but I just want to stress that I never discussed that when I was in office because I didn't want it to become a distraction. And I can certainly tell you that, as far as my commitments, I wasn't going to be dissuaded because somebody was threatening me. I just don't work that way. So but a police intelligence officer, Lieutenant Ed Kovacic, was interviewed on television. He came and told me personally, he said, it's about the light system. You're stopping people from making a lot of money.
Wow. Now, eventually the city was thrown into default as you continued to block the sale, and this came at a political cost to you in the next mayoral race, which you lost to George Voinovich. You anticipated this fight could come at a cost. Why was this a fight you had to take on, even at the expense of your political career?
Because it matters what people pay for electricity. It matters that people have control over their own destiny. It matters that that decisions are dictated to cities by corporations. I was thinking when I was told by the head of the biggest bank in the state of Ohio and one of the 33rd largest bank in the U.S. that either I sell the electric system to the utility in which the bank was a business partner, or they were going to renew the city's credit on loans that I hadn't even taken out. They were going to push the city into default. And when that discussion was going on, I was thinking of my parents counting pennies on an old metal table when I was a kid. They're counting pennies late at night, trying to come up with enough money to pay an electric bill. I mean, these memories are very powerful, and they do have a motivating influence in any of our decision making. And so I was influenced by that. I thought about not just my parents, but of people across the city for whom it matters what they paid for electricity. And if they could get a break on their electric bill, in this case at that time, Munilight was 20% cheaper, then who was I to tell some monopoly that, well, yeah, you can have it because, if I don't give it to you, you're going to punish me. My feeling was I wasn't there for them. I was there for the people. We saved the system. The people voted. Check this out. The people voted for a tax to pay off the debts that I hadn't even incurred. The tax passed. The banks had said that if I put the tax on a ballot and it passed, they'd take the city out of default. Even after it passed, they wouldn't take the city out of default. This was a political game that was being played to actually, it's a coup of sorts to knock out an elected leader. And see, this story, nothing like this has ever been told before in America. It doesn't mean it's never happened, but the story's never been told before, and it becomes relevant today because of the role that money plays in our political process. When I was going to grade school, they had civics classes. That you see the box with the executive, legislative, judicial branch. Well, today, if it was taught, you'd have another box that would put a dollar sign on it, and in some cases that would go above those tripartite branches. So I had to stand for something, and you either stand for something or you kneel.
Yeah, and we could use a lot more of that nowadays, as a matter of fact. We're speaking to Dennis Kucinich, who served as mayor of Cleveland from 77 to 79, later, of course, as a member of the U.S. House of Representatives. And he is the author of a new book, The Division of Light and Power. And Dennis, of course, the story doesn't end with Cleveland in default and you losing an election. In 1996, you were elected to the U.S. House of Representatives and then reelected 7 times. So what changed?
What changed is that the people of Cleveland understood that I put my career on the line for them. And that in 1993, there was an announcement that the system, which I saved, was expanding, that more people would be able to get cheaper electricity. And it wasn't just the ratepayers were saving, taxpayers were saving, because the city handles street lighting, 76 facilities. So the city was going to save more money. And suddenly there was an awareness that I saved the city, at that point, hundreds of millions of dollars with the decision. So, I was working on another draft of the book. I was in California at a friend's house when I got the call about this renaissance of public power in Cleveland. And what happened from that moment on, people were saying, well, wait a minute, Dennis was right. He put his career on the line. And so I was elected to the state Senate on a slogan said, because it was right. And then I was elected to the United States Congress for the first of 8 terms. The first slogan was Light Up Congress. People remember. And in the city of Cleveland, every election I was in, I piled up big majorities in Cleveland because people remembered and they appreciated that I was willing to take a stand. So I have a pretty good constituency here still. And, I never knew that I'd ever have a chance at a political comeback. When I made that decision not to sell, the chances were that my career was over. And I knew that. And it's not like I'm not a martyr, but it's a question of, and I don't think anybody who reads the book is going to find this, what are you willing to do to stand up for what you believe in?
It comes down to principles, right? I mean, you stand for, you believe in something, you've got to stick with that belief, unless somebody can sway you otherwise. But
if I may, this is not just about one person in one city. This is about the question of democratic governance and if it actually exists today in America, and particularly at a local level. So anybody reading this book, this book is a guide to questions that need to be asked in communities across the country, and an encouragement for those who want to take a stand, and shows you how to do it. And it raises the question of who actually rules the community. Where's City Hall? Is it just a building that everybody goes to, or is City Hall in the boardrooms of the banks, the utilities, and in Cleveland's case, the mob? I mean, these are questions that are raised, and they're even more relevant today than they were then, because the stakes are higher today.
And I'm glad you brought it up, because it is a fascinating story, in and of itself, but it does carry plenty of relevance to today's battles over public and state ownership of essential services. Texas comes to mind right now after the horrible winter, the issues that they have with their power grid.
But ERCOT knew 10 years earlier that they had to make improvements on the power grid, and they didn't want to spend the money. I mean, bottom line, they would not spend the money. So as a consequence, you get this storm in Texas, and suddenly millions of people are left without electricity and all the other services that are connected to electricity. And, this is why people must be involved. This is why this book is relevant, because it shows you what happens when the public doesn't really have control over their own lives, and these utilities are calling the shots. It also shows that in Texas' case, the isolation that has occurred, where you're not connected to the national grid. And what's the interesting parallel with Cleveland is that the private utility monopoly stopped our municipal electric system from being connected to the national grid, so we'd have greater reliability. Now, I know there's ideological reasons that people don't want to be connected to, America's energy grid. I understand that, but I can also say that that these decisions that are made that affect our lives, sometimes in a very personal and real way, need to be looked at, and people need to have a chance to get educated about it. And I assume that in Texas in particular, people got more of an education than ever wanted on utilities.
Well, that's just it. I mean, after the fact, you have people saying, who do we call? Who do we call? Well, you wouldn't have to call anybody if it wasn't a private ownership situation. If the government is there to help you out, they can help you out. But when you decide to just walk away, you get what you pay for.
Well, Texas is a very important case in point. You go back to Enron and the kind of crooked thinking that went into that whole enterprise. And, anybody that has control over energy, whatever the form it takes, ultimately, if the people do not have control, mayor of Cleveland over 100 years ago, the person who actually created the municipal electric system in Cleveland, his name was Tom Johnson. He said that I believe in municipal ownership of all public service facilities, because if you do not own them, they will in time own you. They'll corrupt your they'll corrupt your politics, rule your institutions, and finally destroy your liberties. He said that 110 years ago. It's true today.
And Dennis, there is another theme throughout the book, and it's about standing up for the right thing as a politician. And that's basically what you were doing as the mayor in Cleveland. On that count, what would be your advice to a young person just getting started in a political career?
Don't sell out. Don't think that the only way you can get involved in politics is to give your soul to some interest group so you can become their pawn. This is at the very beginning. Be very careful about the relationships that you make, and be careful about the commitments that you make. Because once you get in there, you're going to be very, very hamstrung if you told someone, well, you'll take care of this for them or that for them. I mean, everything about politics today is transactional. You do this for me, I'll do this for you. Doesn't have to be that way. So, number one, go directly to the people. Number two, don't think you have to go through any brokerage in order to approach the people. Don't ask for permission to run. And number three, raise money in as broad a way as you can. Don't take money from just one individual, because it could be hazardous. Sometimes that individual could be clean as a driven snow. Fine. But that's unusual. And, and be true to yourself. Stand up for what you believe in. And don't be afraid to step forward. I think this is probably the toughest thing for anybody who's just starting in politics. What's that first step? When you step forward, everyone else is silent. When you speak your truth, the writer Emerson, in another century ago, talked about going to a lecture and hearing the speaker's words come back to him with what he described as an alienated majesty. He said, "Trust thyself. Every heart vibrates to that iron string." To believe that what's true for you could be true for others as well. So each of us has to trust that inner compass that we have that'll take us in a direction towards the fulfillment of our purpose. And it's important for young people to get into politics, but young people can become old very quickly if they sell out. And that's, something that always has to be kept in mind. It's not just about, well, if we elect somebody younger, if we elect women, look, this is about human nature. And it's also about those who aspire to office to know that you don't have to sell out. And it changes your life when it's a little bit tougher. I will grant you that, as somebody who walked that path. It's the road less traveled. However, you own your own soul. And there is something to that.
Absolutely. And you can sleep at night as well. The name of the book, The Division of Light and Power, the author, former Ohio Congressman Dennis Kucinich, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Dennis, we appreciate your time with us. Would love to do it again sometime soon.
This is a very documented story. This isn't, and that's the power of it. This is all true. So thank you for the opportunity. And the book goes on sale, by the way, on June the 8th.
Fantastic. Thank you again for your time.
Thank you. Bye now.
Goodbye now. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
Perhaps you remember Senator Barry Goldwater, the GOP's fringy far-right-wing 1964 presidential nominee, who famously said, "Extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice." Today, however, the core of the Republican Party has gone so far beyond the fringe that they would boo Goldwater's right-wingism as insufficiently rabid. Instead, their new rallying cry is, "Nuttiness in the defense of extremism is no vice." The GOP's mainline officialdom now proclaim themselves the party of extremism. They are openly embracing the crazy, including conspiracy theorists, neo-Confederates, and QAnon cultists, hoping to harness the fanatical horsepower of these anti-democratic groups to the party's true purpose of entrenching the supremacy of corporate and moneyed elites. Now, this extremism is about to erupt in the GOP's presidential primary, for a whole covey of these cooling right-wingers have fantasies of taking the group's radical agenda to the White House. All of them are trying to out-extreme each other with raw-meat bigotry and autocratic posturing. But two wannabes have emerged as both the most bullish and bullying: Greg Abbott of Texas and Ron DeSantis of Florida. For months, these big state governors have been locked in a far-right cook-off, including outlawing free speech, banning books, viciously attacking immigrants, preempting local elections and governments, and denying health care to poor people. Bear in mind that Abbott and DeSantis are not merely pontificating, posturing, and promising what they might do in the White House. As governors, they're actually practicing it right now. This is Jim Hightower saying, I don't know if Abbott and DeSantis are the worst that the GOP can do, but pay attention, for today's Republican elites intend to pull our democracy down into the plutocratic, autocratic, and theocratic maelstrom they're creating. Howdy-ho, folks. Thanks for tuning in and sharing my weekly commentaries. Also, please join me for a live web show I host every other Tuesday, the Hightower Lowdown Happy Hour at the Chat and Chew Cafe. You can join the action live online as I chat with grassroots leaders and progressive sparklies from around the country. Go to hightowerlowdown.org/chat-and-chew to find out about upcoming guests and watch past episodes. That's hightowerlowdown.org/chat-and-chew.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. And we say hello to Julie Kohn, historian of energy, technology, and the environment, affiliated with both the Center for Energy Studies at Rice University's Baker Institute and the University of Houston's Center for Public History. She's also the author of The Grid, Biography of an American Technology. Julie Kohn, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Jim, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me.
You're quite welcome, and the pleasure is ours. You recently wrote an op-ed for the Washington Post titled, Texas Seceded from the Nation's Power Grid, Now It's Paying the Price. And to understand your argument, I think we first need to ask you to explain to us exactly what that power grid is and really why they exist.
Sure. First, it's important to recognize that the word the grid, or the phrase the grid, is a colloquialism. It's not a technical term, and it's used differently by different people. It usually refers to the combination of generating plants, transmission lines, substations that moves electricity from the generating source to a distribution network for customers. Sometimes it also includes the distribution network. But it's a word that makes it easy to think about that system out there that gets electricity to us. In the United States, there are actually three major power networks or grids in North America: the Eastern Interconnection, the Western Interconnection, and the Texas Interconnection, which is also referred to as ERCOT. The Electric Reliability Council of Texas, called ERCOT, is the entity that actually operates the grid inside of Texas, although it doesn't own any of the pieces of it. And the development of the grid dates back to the turn of the last century, when power companies were trying to build up their customer base. And they had three big reasons that they wanted to link up with each other and other companies. One was to have better control over their energy resources. So, for example, a power company with a hydroelectric plant could sell a lot of electricity when the water was running high and needed to buy electricity from somebody else when the water was running low. And a coal-fired plant could do the reverse. And in essence, this was a conservation move at the beginning of the 20th century to kind of manage the use of energy resources. The second reason was that if you wanted to build a bigger market and install a bigger generator, you had to reach further. And by interconnecting, power companies could do that. They could build up a diverse base of users and they could achieve economies of scale. And then the third reason, which is really relevant to what happened in Texas recently, is that by interconnecting, companies could have access to backup power without having to invest in their own backup generating plant or storage batteries. The other thing that's important to know is what the grid is not. And in the United States, it is not a national grid, and we do not have an electricity boss.
Well, and as you describe it, 90% of Texas is intentionally isolated from the rest of the country. How was this decision made, and how much of the decision was a free market sensibility and perhaps a preference for deregulation?
Well, it wasn't the result of a single decision. In fact, this again dates back to the beginning of the last century. Texas power companies, just like power companies everywhere else, chose to interconnect for the same reasons. And some of them, they tended to connect with whoever was nearby initially. So for example, the Houston Lighting and Power Company here where I live in Houston had interconnections eventually that reached all the way into Louisiana, as well as west into other parts of Texas. And they were owned by often holding companies, which owned facilities all over the country. Until 1907, there was almost no regulation of power companies in the United States. In 1907, the first two states started regulating who could generate and deliver electricity and where, and they set the rates for those entities. And by 1920, almost every state in the country had that kind of regulation, but not Texas. So the Texas power companies actually had quite a lot of autonomy, whether they were publicly owned like a municipal company or privately owned. In 1935, Congress passed what's known as the Public Utility Holding Company Act. And the intent of this was to break up the holding companies, which by that point were perceived as being in some part responsible for the Great Depression and being unfair to customers and to some of their stockholders. And one of the requirements of that act was that if a company had a lot of properties, say in Texas, Louisiana, Maine, California, et cetera, they would have to sell those off unless they could be interconnected with each other. So the holding companies that had properties in Texas fought this act, as did most of the others around the country. Sometime in the 1940s, most of them had to either go ahead and sell off their properties or interconnect. And companies in Texas, like Houston Lighting Power, again, were sold off. So then they were now truly independent within Texas. And that was around the same time that the Texas power companies decided to form what's known as the Texas Interconnected Systems. And they did this because this was the beginning of World War II. They wanted to participate in the war effort. They wanted to achieve more efficiency and generate more power to support that effort. And I believe it was probably at around that time that they made the decision to keep all of their operations within Texas, because that way there was no regulation in Texas and they would also not have to face federal regulation. That continued and still continues today, even though there were many other points when either individual power companies or system planners or others said, maybe we should reconsider this. Maybe there would be advantages to connecting outside of Texas. And there have been studies over the past, 30, 40 years looking at this or longer. But for the most part, I think the Texas companies found that it was economically favorable to keep their operations within the state. And over time, it became both technically and physically more difficult to build true interconnections outside the state.
And Julie, your piece explains the outcomes of this decision to operate an independent power grid in Texas. I would say it's best described as a mixed bag. Among other things, you write that the wholesale power market in Texas offers scant incentives for investment in backup power. Why is that the case?
Well, I think the way it was designed, the intent was to show that the market could serve all needs. Again, let me just give a very quick historical perspective. Back in the olden days, when states were regulating all these power companies, and eventually Texas did join the party in 1975, I'm a generator. I build a new power plant. I build enough generation so that I can sell power on normal days and have backup for really bad days. And then I go to the state regulator and I say, I built this power plant. It cost me this much money. I want you to let me charge my customers this rate to recover my costs and make a profit. Once Texas opened up the wholesale power market to competitive generating facilities, that was gone. And the only way a generating facility in Texas gets paid back for its investment in a wind plant, a coal-fired plant, whatever it is in the open market. And we have what's called an energy-only market. So you only get paid when you sell electricity. And it's also a reverse auction. So the way it works is whoever offers their electricity into the grid at the cheapest price, ERCOT takes that first. And they match that to what the anticipated demand will be. And then they take the next cheapest price and they keep building it up until there's going to be enough electricity to meet the demand. And then everybody gets paid the top price. So you only get paid when you're selling electricity and only at whatever the market has risen to in that reverse auction. So let's say you invest in an extra generator to take care of the icy cold winter day. You're not going to get paid for that until the icy cold day happens. And when it happens, you don't know in advance how much you might get paid. Now, the market does provide the opportunity for the price to go from what would be typical $50 per megawatt hour all the way up to $9,000 per megawatt hour under those emergency conditions. But again, it might not be for 10 years that you would get your money back. Mm-hmm. So that's the incentive. And that's the problem with the incentive.
Yeah, I would say so. We're speaking to Julie Kohn, a historian of energy, technology, and the environment, affiliated with both the Center for Energy Studies at Rice University's Baker Institute and the University of Houston's Center for Public History. Julie's also the author of The Grid, Biography of an American Technology. So let's talk about what happens when it goes wrong. As the title of your op-ed indicates, Texas is paying the price for leaving the nation's power grid. What would you say is the simplest way to understand what led to that deadly power blackout in February within the context of the state's, let's say, unique power grid and market structure?
Well, there are the proximate causes and the longer term causes. So the proximate causes were, first of all, an unprecedented weather event. We've never had it become, or in recorded history, it hasn't been that cold for that long across that much of Texas. Second, there was an unprecedented winter demand for electricity because it was so cold. Third, generators of all types froze, so there wasn't enough power to meet that unprecedented demand. Fourth, the natural gas supply also froze, which meant that gas-fired power plants couldn't get their fuel once they were able to start generating it again. And fifth, the planning entity saw that the grid was heading into a power failure, which is different in kind from what we actually experienced. It looked like the grid was going to shut down. So they initiated the rolling blackouts, which eventually became longer-term blackouts that lasted while the supply failed to return to meet demand over the course of several days. So that was what happened in terms of the immediate experience. What were the longer-term issues? Well, the generators, although there had been recommendations to do so, had failed to weatherize their facilities. That's why they froze. There was a failure to follow through on some simple protections that could have alleviated some of the problem. And what I mean by that is that after a similar but not as bad storm in 2011, there was a recommendation that the gas suppliers, the people who operate the gas pipelines, apply to be essential services, which would mean that when there's a rolling blackout, their power would still stay on. And this, so normally if there's going to be a rolling blackout for whatever reason, you keep the power on at the police station, the hospitals, the fire station, so on and so forth. And there was a simple 2-page form these entities could fill out to say, we need to be an essential service also, so that they could keep the gas supply going to the gas-fired power plants. And many of them failed to do that because it was not a requirement and there was nobody looking over their shoulder to make sure it was done. Third, there was the failure of market incentives to produce extra protections and backup power, as we discussed previously. And then this is a conjecture on my part, but I believe fourth, ERCOT in its planning scenarios probably didn't anticipate this kind of winter storm. And so when they looked at, do we have enough power for a winter storm, they were relying on the experiences of the last 20, 30 years, and they planned for that and they thought they'd be okay. And it was just so much colder and for so much longer that we weren't okay. Mm-hmm. There is no coordination of substantial merit at the state level for different energy systems. And I think that was another major issue. I mentioned this problem with the natural gas pipelines. The natural gas pipelines in the state are regulated by what's called the Texas Railroad Commission, which has nothing to do with trains. And, and the electric power system is regulated by the Public Utility Commission of Texas, and the two have nothing to do with each other in a formal way. So that's a really serious problem. And then from my personal perspective, I felt there was insufficient notice to the public of what might happen in the context of the pending storm. I wasn't expecting to be that cold that week for that long.
Yeah, right. Well, and in fact, I have a friend who lives not too far from Houston and went through the same thing, and every day was thought, well, when is this going to end? When is this going to end? And it got scary for them. You know, he's got a couple of little kids, and it was kind of scary for him. And you mentioned the megawatt, where it's normally around $50 and it jumps up to $9,000. So in addition to the system failing, customers also received huge electricity bills for the time period following the storm. How is that connected to the way the wholesale power market is designed in Texas? I think there might be a little bit of disconnect as to how that could happen.
Sure. And it's important to note that was a small percentage of all power customers in the state. So in addition to having a competitive wholesale power market, Texas has a competitive retail market, which some refer to as the power to choose. That means each year I get to pick my electricity provider, and I can choose among providers who offer a fixed rate. It'll be so many cents per kilowatt hour for the next year or the next 2 years or whatever, no matter how much electricity I use. Or you could get a variable rate where it's so much up to 1,000 kilowatts. And then, if you use more than that, you have to pay a higher price. Or if you use less than that, there are all these different variable rates. And then there were plans like one that's infamously now called Gritty, where you pay a very small amount per month. I think it's $10 per month. And the rest of your monthly bill is tied to the wholesale price of electricity. And this was conceived, I believe, to help power customers have more control over their energy use and their energy bill. If you paid attention, you could see, oh, the price is going up. I'm going to wait until it goes down again to run my dishwasher or whatever your electrical appliances are. And we actually know people who signed up with Gritty, and they're, electricity nerds or household finance nerds or whatever, and they watch carefully and they decide when to run which thing. And when Gritty warned their customers that prices might go up because of the winter storm, they actually said, okay, that's it, we're done with Gritty, we're switching over to a fixed rate plan. So it was really a caveat emptor situation, a buyer beware situation, because these plans were designed to do exactly what they did, which is follow the wholesale price. Now, personally, I think for the average customer, that kind of tracking is much too sophisticated or of not much interest to the average customer. And so people who chose those plans because in most months they're really cheap, way cheaper than the fixed rates. In February, they were far and beyond the opposite of that. They were exorbitantly expensive and bank breaking for some households. So the way that it's linked to the wholesale market is that the price is actually tied to that wholesale price.
Mm-hmm. But here's the thing that gets me. You're isolated right there in Texas. In other words, if for some reason you thought, gosh, maybe the Eastern grid could help us, or maybe the Western grid can help, that's not an option for Texas, is it?
Not currently, no. That's correct. Yeah.
And that to me is, well, that's all well and good that I've found out a really cheap way to get my energy. But when I'm not even getting any energy because it's all shut down because they haven't winterized, which they wouldn't expect they'd need to do, it's kind of a scary thought to me, to where you lay yourself. I guess a lesson has been learned, I hope.
I hope so too. Yeah.
Well, and then, of course, Texas regulators now face that challenge of reforming the system, I would think, to avoid a disaster such as what happened in February from happening again. What do you see as some of the key decisions that need to be taken on?
Well, I think there are a number, and it's important to recognize that both legislators and policymakers have to reckon with this situation, because some of the framework of our system is established by state law, and other parts are established by the policies made by the Public Utility Commission. So both legislators and policymakers have to get on board with fixing the problem. And our state legislature is in session right now. Your listeners may not know this, but they meet for 5 months every other year. So it's a very intense and quick legislative session. But this has been top of mind for obvious reasons. And so they're considering various pieces of legislation right now. I think there's some really short-term obvious things to do that could have very clear long-term benefits. The first being high-level coordination of the energy systems and other essential utilities like water and transportation and so forth, so that people are planning together for these kinds of weather events and responding to them in real time together. And then the second would be to review the system planning tools that are used to assure that weather patterns, new and emerging weather patterns, are addressed within the state planning. And then the third, of course, would be to get all those gas service providers to fill out the 2-page paperwork to be sure they have electricity on so they can get the fuel to the gas-fired power plants. A little longer term, I think it behooves the legislature and the Utility Commission to reassess both the wholesale and retail markets and determine how they could better build in both incentives and guardrails so that the next time there's either a hurricane or a winter storm or an excessive heat wave in the summer, the system is better prepared to address it. I think another really important thing, which people haven't spoken about as much, is to assess off-grid resilience. In other words, maybe the state should be looking at helping all dwellings insulate against both very hot and very cold temperatures. Maybe look at better insulation of water systems in homes and apartment buildings. Maybe expand plans for warming and cooling centers during major weather events, and identifying at-risk populations and figuring out how you're going to relocate those people if necessary. We do some of that because we have hurricanes, but those preparations could be expanded to address all other, a lot of other kinds of emergency scenarios. Up-leveling the warning systems so people know what to expect. Researching islanding options, setting up smaller microgrid scenarios where different areas could be islanded if you're shutting down portions of the larger grid and could still have power locally, at least for short periods of time. So, there's a variety of those kinds of things. And then much longer term, going back to the point you made before, I think it's time to revisit the studies that have looked at building stronger links between Texas and the other interconnected systems. There are benefits to doing that. Some are obvious, like perhaps accessing more backup power during a winter storm or maybe even the summer. There are also economic benefits for certain generators, like the wind generators in the Texas Panhandle would probably love to sell their power to other customers not in Texas when it's super windy. And then there are some really big challenges. There's the cost of building the transmission infrastructure. There's a question of whether or not the public will have a palette for agreeing to see that infrastructure built through their communities and across their properties. Recently, there's been a lot of opposition to new energy infrastructure. So big transmission lines are not exempt from that.
Yeah, and there's a big fight about new transmission lines and gas lines in the Mid-Atlantic area right now going on, and have been going on for several years and continue.
Right.
So
Right.
that is a tough one. I wondered if the option of perhaps working out some way to tie into one or both of the other major grids, east and west, was on the table. Is that realistic that would actually come to fruition?
I don't know that it's either realistic or not realistic politically. I think it's really more a question of whether or not the benefits will ultimately outweigh the costs. And I also think it's a very long-term solution. I mean, it takes something like 10 years plus to conceive of a big transmission line and then get it into operation. So that's something that I hope that people will look at really seriously, and better understand in a very straightforward way how this could benefit the state, ways in which it might not be beneficial. It would put us in the position of helping others as well. So we have to assess, does that make sense? And then electrically, there are questions because the Texas grid, even though it went through this experience recently, historically has been a very reliable grid. And so to coordinate operations with another very large grid that's, significantly larger, like 10 times larger, that requires certain technical interventions. I don't think I could begin to envision what those are, but that requires technical interventions that will take some time to work out if in fact that becomes the desirable solution.
Okay. Julie Kohn, historian of energy technology and the environment, author of The Grid, Biography of an American Technology, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Julie, we appreciate it. Great having you with us. We'd love to have you back again soon.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
I'm really struck by the title to your book, Confidence Man. I mean, I thought I knew what it meant. Webster says a confidence man is a person who tricks other people in order to get their money. You have covered Donald Trump almost exclusively for 6 years. Is that how you sum him up?
Well, I think that there's two ways to look at this title, Bill. And one is certainly that everything about Donald Trump is about projecting confidence, which is, his MO. But the other is that, we're talking about somebody who has a very long history of assuring people that he is something that he isn't. And I think definitionally that meets the confidence man definition.
And tricking people, right? Using lies, using kind of exaggerations or kind of whatever to con people.
I mean, he convinces people that he is something that he is not, and he convinces them, be it his customers or be it, frankly, the voters who are very hard to shake loose from him at this point, whether it was intentionally through his own lies and his own artifice built brick by brick through news stories over the course of the 70s, 80s, and 90s, or whether it was through the art of television and The Apprentice. He has a very long history of convincing people that he is something that he isn't and using that to his advantage.
So you indicated earlier, and that was certainly my big takeaway from the book, is that you can't really, your point, I think you wanted people to know, is you can't really know Donald Trump today or understand Donald Trump today unless you know him, where he came from, right, and how he got there. Tell us a little about that. What are the threads that you see?
So I tried to go back and look at some of the key influences on him, and those people were his father, Fred, about whom a fair amount's been written, Roy Cohn, about whom, endless ink has been spilled, George Steinbrenner, the former owner of the Yankees, who stylistically, was a big influence for Trump. And then I think, frankly, there's been less attention on this and less understanding of it, but Roger Stone, without whom there really is no Trump presidency ultimately, for a variety of reasons. And so I wanted to look at the people who shaped him, and I wanted to look at the forces that shaped him in New York City during a period of time where corruption touched so many aspects of life, the media, the real estate business that his family ran, aspects of his own family's business, the political system in New York City, which was still very, very, derivative of the Tammany Hall era in terms of machine boss politics, and then his own idiosyncrasies as a person. And I wanted to show how all of those factors, contributed to what he exported to Washington and to the Republican Party.
The phrase that you use is frozen in time.
There has been a real preserved in amber quality to him, Bill, that you can see when he speaks publicly. His cultural touchstones are all from the 1980s. He talks about how many times he's on the cover of national news magazines. He talks about movies from that era, and most significantly, his view of crime and his sort of view of fear-based politics is stuck in that era. And it was an era in New York City when the crime rate was incredibly high, and despite efforts, and crime is on the mind of a number of voters nationally right now.
Sure.
But despite what people keep saying, it is, at least in New York City, it is nothing like what it was back then. And so, he really learned about how you make these appeals to fear. And one thing that I explored too was, in his reaction to the very famous Central Park jogger case in 1989, in which a white banker was found brutalized in Central Park after she had been on a jog. She was found several hours later. Several teenagers, all of color, were arrested. And Trump, even before any trial had commenced, took out a full-page ad in the newspapers saying, "Bring back the death penalty, bring back our police." And it was a full-page ad that glorified police brutality, that talked about unshackling the cops. And he takes aim at something Ed Koch, the mayor, was saying to people, which was that he didn't want the public to have, quote unquote, hate and rancor for these young men in their hearts. And Trump says, and I'm paraphrasing, but he says, I want people to hate them. I want that. And it was as clear a guiding ethos as anything that Trump would articulate publicly, which was that hate should be a civic good. And I think that, as much as anything, is something that he exported as well.
So I thought I knew Trump pretty well, but reading about his MO, if you will, as a young developer, I was really struck by this was a guy that we saw, 20, 30 years later in the White House. I want to read for our listeners. Maggie, you quote Alan Marcus, who was one of his consultants at the Trump Organization. Here, page 139, I'm reading from, quote, Trump was an intimidating, he said this back then, Trump was an intimidating figure who wore people down. He was as overbearing with his own executives as he was with reporters, always pressing a fanciful narrative which exaggerated his worth, his ability as a manager, his relationships with women, etc. The narrative was more important than reality. Boom.
That's right. And the narrative is what got him elected. The narrative is what he tried to control throughout 4 years of his presidency. He came to realize that if he could convince people that what he was saying was real, the details and the facts didn't really matter. And I have to say, he lost the election, obviously, in 2020, despite what he says. I'm not sure that would have been the case if he had handled COVID even remotely competently and seriously. He has appealed to a lot of people across this country with that narrative. And it is a reminder of, again, the power of the television medium. And I think it is a reminder for those of us in our business, certainly in the print business and what I do, the unintended consequences of some of what we do.
Mm-hmm. There were two things that he excelled in as a developer, which again struck me as something he certainly continued through the rest of his career and certainly in the White House. Let me ask you first, filing lawsuits. I mean, do you have any idea of how many lawsuits this guy has filed in his professional career?
There was a tracker that USA Today did at some point. I think it was in 2016, and I think even then it didn't capture everything because he's obviously filed many more. It's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, and he's been and let me just asterisk that the hundreds and hundreds include not just things he's filed, but cases that have been filed against him or that he's been a party to. He is the most litigious elected official that I have ever covered. Certainly the most litigious president, and it is another one of these things that he has exported to the Republican Party is that threats of lawsuits are much more prolific than they used to be.
Right, and he makes it pretty clear, right? He admits he doesn't file these lawsuits because he thinks he's got a good case or he expects to win. Right?
Sometimes it's to cause pain. I mean, he was when he talked to Paul Farhi at the Washington Post in 2016 about the lawsuit that he had filed against Tim O'Brien, who wrote the book Trump Nation, which there was a single line in there that Trump zeroed in on for his lawsuit, which was about his net worth, and Trump lost that lawsuit, but Trump was very clear that he did it to cause Tim pain, and I want to make clear too, he does this also to chill other people from taking on similar exercises.
Yeah, I remember the phrase, I did it to make his life miserable.
Yes, very understated, yes.
And the other practice is just this total disregard for the truth. I mean, you open up with this incredible scene when he's 18 years old at the dedication of a bridge, and he's there with his father, and he talks about it, and he lies about the whole deal.
Nothing about the anecdote that he tells is true, with the exception of he gets. I don't think I mentioned this, but he gets the bridge designer's age right. But he's talking about that's it. He's talking about this moment, and he describes it 14 years later, and then he did other times too. Where he's attending the opening ceremony of the dedication ceremony of the Verrazano Bridge connecting Brooklyn to Staten Island. And it was, a lengthy project that had taken forever to actually push through. And it was, Robert Moses, who was the subject of The Power Broker, the Robert Caro book, and who someone who Trump and his father, Fred, admired, was the master of ceremonies. And in describing this bridge engineer, who is this very mild-mannered guy, Moses just praises him to the hilt as a historic figure. He just forgets to say his name. And Trump later describes this as the rain was pouring down for hours and everyone was congratulating each other. And there's this poor guy in the corner and he gets the country the man's from wrong. And no one even pays attention to him and no one acknowledges him. And it wasn't raining. It was incredibly sunny. You can watch the video of it. It's online. And it's just amazing how, his comments, and I write about this, went unchecked for years, because who would imagine somebody would get such details wrong?
Yeah. Or even, particularly somebody, that young, that impressionable. Also, he lied about the value of his properties, right? As Michael Cohen testified in front of Congress much later. He lied about his net worth, right? He just lied about everything and got away with it.
Right. And got away with it. I mean, it's funny, Michael Cohen's House oversight testimony really helped accelerate this investigation, which then became a lawsuit by the New York Attorney General against him and his children and their company. There were decades of this where, and I try to show this in the book, a lot of people knew that he said things that weren't true. Reporters knew it, politicians knew it, prosecutors knew it, but he was sort of part of the system. And it's something that he said actually himself in 2016 about how I give to these politicians and, they take my calls. And he wasn't wrong.
Right. I was struck by the parallel that how the banks, again, lying about his net worth, and some of this came out, or what he had put in the property or what it was worth. But the banks kind of stuck with him, right? Because he intimidated them. They were almost afraid to cross him.
Well, yeah, I just want to actually just add one asterisk to that. I think intimidated, but also I think that he scared them into
Hmm.
believing that it was a greater risk to them financially to cut him loose.
Yeah.
And I think that was a big piece of it.
So the parallel I was looking at, is that what motivated in 2016 so many Republicans who were afraid of cutting him loose?
I think it's part of it. Sure. I mean, I think that he intimidated them not because they were afraid of what he would do to them directly himself, but what he could do to them with his voters,
Right.
who are also their voters, and that remains to this day.
You mentioned Roger Stone. I was surprised. I didn't realize how early Roger Stone shows up in Donald Trump's life. But actually, before he ran for president in 2016, he had looked at it, right, or been tempted 3 times, including one in 2011 when you kind of took him more seriously than maybe you should have, as you point out. But Roger Stone was there urging him to run for president in 1988.
Yeah, Roger Stone was with him in 1987 when
Yeah.
Trump was announcing, unveiling The Art of the Deal, the book that cemented this image of him that was totally contrary with who he actually is, and was part of the myth making about himself. But Stone, described to me by several people as the person who really came up with this idea of combining a book launch with a presidential candidacy float. And Stone goes with him to New Hampshire, where this draft effort that Stone has said he helped arrange was being conducted by a local resident. Stone at the time was committed to another candidate, and he was wearing like Groucho Marx glasses on the Trump helicopter.
He was in disguise, right?
He was in disguise, yes. And then a year later, he commissions from Doug Schoen, the pollster who's done a ton of work for, among others, Mike Bloomberg, this 95-page report about public opinion of Donald Trump in the country. And it's too late for Trump to run that cycle, but it seemed aimed at trying to sell Trump on a future in national politics. Realistically, they would not be the first consultants to do that with, a wealthy candidate, even one who's not as wealthy as he says he is. But one of the things that was interesting to me about that poll was that it showed that there really was a vein for Trump to tap into, but it also tested how people would react to Trump not paying income tax. And I was fascinated that they tested it that early.
Right. Interesting. The old phrase, by your friends, you shall know them, or by their friends, you shall know them. We talk about Roger Stone. Well, first of all, does Donald Trump have any friends?
Not in the conventional sense. My colleague Alan Foyer wrote a great piece in 2016 about Trump having no friends, and it was and Trump reacted very angrily to it. He has people who I think consider themselves his friends to a point, but he just doesn't experience friendship the way most people do.
So whether we call them, I don't know, allies or hangers on, when you look at the people around Trump, right? In addition to Roger Stone, right? You've got Michael Cohen, you got Steve Bannon, you got Roy Cohn, as you mentioned. I mean, Rudy Giuliani, Sidney Powell, John Eastman. I mean, these are like the most odious people in American politics. I was wondering, where's Dick Morris, right?
Dick, he's around. He's in the book. I mean, he's an old family friend of the Trumps, and Dick Morris is somebody to whom during the 2020 campaign, Trump instructed people to send Dick Morris polling data. And these questions start showing up when the real pollsters like Tony Fabrizio are doing their work, and it's Morris suggesting them.
Yeah. So you got to admit, I mean, with that gang of, I don't want to say gang of thug, but that gang of questionable characters, it says a lot about Trump himself, doesn't it?
Trump gravitates toward a certain kind of person and always has. One of the things that Bill Barr told people in 2020 when he was leaving was that, he left in December shortly before the presidency ended, but that, he had not really understood sort of why Trump seemed to prefer some of these characters and really gravitated toward them, but he does, the Stones and others. I think that goes back to that Roy Cohn infused view of the world.
If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.